a 9% rate of return in the ETF versus a 7% rate of return in property. That's essentially what we're looking at. And obviously you need to standardize those returns because there's things in there like fees and tax and inflation and stuff. But this is really simplified just to get an understanding of comparing the two using the historical data.
Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics such as investing, cash flow, budgeting, saving, passive income, debt management, and much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Vils, here we are back again, bringing a heap of value to our viewers and our listeners.
We are, Andrew. I'm going to take a little bit of a sort of similar slant that we have been recently property, but sort of comparing, I guess, two comparisons or two questions that we get asked comparing
two different scenarios. Talking about shit on the round these days. Look, I find every, finance, TikTok, social media, is talking about, what we're about to talk about.
So this is it, as a first home buyer, should you buy your first home or should you invest in this instance, we're going to say ETFs, or should you invest, right? So they're kind of the two differentiators. That's the question that we're going to answer and give you a financial advisor's guide to how we think about it. But I reckon you're right about being in the media recently or being heard of a lot more recently because the government talking it up at the moment about providing more and more support to first home buyers. And they're using that as the tip of the spear, so to speak, to talk about and no doubt eventually push through in the May budget the changes to capital gains tax.
Yeah.
So rather than addressing their failings about building enough stock, they're using something else to tax the population. I don't think it's going to make a difference, by the way. Debate and timestamp it. We're in at the start of March.
Yeah.
We'll wait to see what happens.
Yeah. Well, I guess, look, aside from the political rant aside, I guess, one of the questions that we tend to get asked and, people are talking about, and I would say maybe unlicensed financial advice, but hey, you know what? Didn't hear it from me. I think one of the most popular videos that you see going around these days is don't buy your first house. House isn't an asset. Don't buy property. Let's take that money and what you would put in property, rent where you live, and put the excess into an ETF.
Yeah.
You pick your ETF, whether people are talking about, an S&P or an ASX or whichever it is. So we're not going to talk about the specifics of an individual investment, but rather more generally speaking, like, what do you do? How do you even start to look at what the options are with this, Bills?
Yeah. And look, you're talking at the root of this thing, you're talking about two different types of asset classes, right? So it's really difficult to compare in that sense. We will talk about historical returns and bits and pieces and things, but fundamentally they're so different. You've got things like liquidity considerations. If you've got a property and you need to liquidate it, you have to sell a property, right? You can't sell a portion of it. Diversification, you buy one property in one location, in one state, in one country, in one suburb, right? Generally, when you purchase a property, for the majority of us mere mortals out here, we are borrowing money from the bank and taking leverage. So not only does that obviously increase the gains or magnify the losses, but it also increases the risk associated with it as well too. Then you've got control over the, one particular asset being your house. Maybe you don't have as much control over the investments that sit inside an ETF. And fundamentally, they're designed for two different things. One is purely, for shelter. In this instance, we're talking about it from an investment perspective. And the other one is just purely from an investment point of view. So that's what makes it so challenging when we do have this conversation with people and this debate that keeps raging on. But we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the things applicable and associated with it. And then what we'll do is talk about some rates and return. And the numbers are one thing, and this is why it becomes so challenging. The numbers are one thing, but sticking to a strategy and sticking with it is another thing. So we'll just keep that little Easter egg in there and we'll come back to that one. But Andrew, I think a good place to start, other than highlighting the key differences with them, the different costs. So that obviously the entry costs, and the ongoing expenses, because we can't put those aside.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think when you're considering, property versus an ETF, property is by far a much more expensive asset to get into. And this is both when you're looking at the entry costs, when you're looking at ongoing costs, even potentially when you're considering the sell costs, right? So, when you compare costs that are associated with entering into property, one, you need a deposit. Okay, that's fine because that's, what you need as capital in order to enter into an investment. So I'm not necessarily going to use that as a cost. But when you consider maybe there's mortgage insurance, if you don't have a 20% deposit or if you're not using the, 5% LMI, but, for a portion of purchases, there's lender's mortgage insurance or LMI. There's stamp duty. Again, assuming that you're buying, either over the limit for stamp duty, depending on various states and whether it's an investment or owner-occupied property. But generally speaking, you're talking about like 5.5% of the value of the property. There's conveyancing.
Yep.
There's the cost of doing building and pest inspections. There's the you get over the initial costs that are associated with it. There's interest on mortgage. There's fees that are associated with your mortgage. There's potentially land tax if it's an investment property. There's rates. There's maintenance. But there is a huge amount of cost that goes into purchasing and maintaining a property.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the flip side of it, let's say you want to exit that asset class. There's sell costs. You need to, it might still, in this scenario, we're talking about purchasing your first home, so we're talking about owner-occupied property. But nonetheless, still have to pay an agent to sell it. Still need to advertise it. Maybe you're staging the property. So the costs regarding exiting are very, very significant. Versus an ETF, it's basically nothing. There's some brokerage costs that might get associated with it. But open up a platform and whoever you do it with, and your transaction costs are minimal in comparison. So it's very quick, very easy, can enter with very little friction costs. And that makes a difference.
Yeah.
Costs really do make a significant difference as to how an investment is going to perform.
Yeah. And I think it's probably a good time to point out from our perspectives, generally speaking, we advocate for people doing both, right? So if you can get property as part of your investment strategy, as well as an ETF, some other form of investment, we're big advocates of doing a whole heap of stuff if you can potentially do that. So even though we may be painting the picture that in that instance, the ETF is the way to go because of the entry costs and the exit costs as well too, from our perspective, it's usually do both. But what I'm really excited about getting into is talking about some of the historical returns of what this looks like. Just because I think this helps put kind of a number around this, and it's not going to do it justice. And I wish we almost had like a compounding calculator so we could talk this out, but the length of the investment obviously is going to make a substantial difference here too. But if we look at, what are we looking at? Maybe we look at an Australian and a global ETF versus capital growth in property markets, right? So what we're using here is we're using, say, a Vanguard index chart, and we'll look at the Australian market. So in particular, the ASX top 200. Over 30 years, that's done 9.3%. And then if we use the same Vanguard US stock market, it's done 10.8%. So you're not going to have 100% of your money in one of those buckets. You're probably going to split it up a little bit in both of those. But just from a high level perspective, let's add them together, or even let's take the lower rate of return and polish it off a bit. You're sitting just above 9%. All right. So that's the rate of return that it's done on average over the last 30 years per annum, looking at Vanguard in terms of the data they have provided. And property prices historically, and we're talking Australian property prices.
Yep. And we're talking residential property. So it's not a listed property, but rather a residential property asset class.
Historically, we're talking 6.5% to 7%. So if you think of a rate of return, just to put this into context, there's a general saying that property prices double every 10 years. any asset that doubles in 10 years, you need an annualized rate of return of 7.2%. So that's roughly where it comes from. There is also yield associated with that as well too. So that if you're getting rental income, there's the rental income. But to compare apples with apples, you'd almost assume, for the sake of this calculation, that the holding cost associated with the mortgage, the rental yield is going to go to servicing mortgage. So let's talk a 9% rate of return in the ETF versus a 7% rate of return in property. That's essentially what we're looking at. And obviously you need to standardize those returns because there's things in there like fees and tax and inflation and stuff. But this is really simplified just to get an understanding of comparing the two using the historical data that we've got. So when you look at that, 2% doesn't sound like a lot. But that's where I was saying I wish we had the compounding calculator to be able to, project that out because it is quite substantial.
Yeah. And so from what it sounds like, all the, TikTok gurus are right. Property is not the way to be, or property is not where you need to be. It's in ETFs, it's in shares, it's in, managed funds, ETFs, whatever it is, because your holding costs are higher. You're not getting the same rate of return. And as a result, you less liquid, less ability to sell, pivot, move, and adjust. And I think that what really brings property into the mix is a combination of a couple of things, but one of the biggest, and if not the biggest impact as to why property is such a powerful asset class, irrespective of everything else negative, that is leverage. Mm-hmm. You cannot purchase any other asset and have the same level of leverage without taking on an extreme amount of risk. I mean, yes, sure, you can go down some pretty obscure assets, very, very small deposits and things like that. But generally speaking, you cannot invest 20% of your own money, 80% of the bank money, or 10% of your own money, or 5% of your own money in any other asset class and genuinely sleep at night, I think. I mean, look, maybe there's some people that, have a much higher risk tolerance than me, but I can't stand behind any other investment as an advisor with such a little deposit of your own money. What difference does leverage make? Well, again, overly simplistic scenario here. So let's, take someone who has $100,000. Let's say that we're talking about someone purchasing an owner-occupied property and they're putting and let's say it's a $600,000 asset, so we can exclude stamp duty. And let's say that person is putting a 10% deposit. So still got 40 grand that's left aside. We're excluding all of the other transaction costs. If they invest in a $600,000 property, utilizing $60,000 of their own money, and that property performs, let's say, at that 7% return that we were talking about when we were sort of initially going through all of this, then you're talking about making, in essence, an additional $40,000 over the course of a year, right? In 1 year. Let's take that same person and let's say that same person doesn't invest in a property. Let's say that they take that $60,000 and they invest in an ETF. And let's say that ETF performs at 10%, which is on the higher end of what we were saying. $60,000 investment, growing at a rate of 10%, they've made $6,000. The difference is so large in absolute dollar value that even when you're taking on, and yes, you need to account for the interest that's associated with paying a mortgage. Yes, you need to account for some of the other expenses, but you're talking about a $34,000 difference in those two scenarios with a lower rate of growth. And the reason for that is leverage. Yeah. Your ability to borrow, your ability to not use all of your own funds is what makes property such a powerful investment. Now, the reverse is also true. So if that property goes down by 10%, then you're not only covering the interest, you're not only covering the mortgage, you're also covering the loss, on leverage as well. It's going to magnify your gains, it's going to magnify your losses. But if we're looking at a historical context of 30-year returns, you're talking about a stark difference in absolute dollars at the end of it when you're talking about the difference of an asset that's leveraged at 10%, at 90% versus an asset that's leveraged to zero.
Yeah, it's when you put it into those terms, it's pretty substantial.
That's 1 year. And we found that over 30 years that the difference can be huge.
Well, we have a conversation with people, and in that instance, using say, $60,000 as the money that you put in, and you go, okay, it's done a 10% rate of return. That is huge, right?
Yeah.
But then the client or the person sits there who's looking at it and goes, but it's only $6,000. Like, that's nothing special. Yeah, 10% special, but $6,000 is not, right? So yeah, it makes it harder to compare those, which is interesting. I think the other thing from a property perspective, I mean, we touched on leverage. One of the things that I wanted to introduce is from an understanding perspective, most people that I speak to tend to have more of a natural lean towards property simply because they understand it, right? You understand how it works. You buy a house, it's tangible, it's physical, you can touch it. Yes, I get a tenant in, they're in there, they pay rent because they live there. The property price appreciates over time and away you go. Whereas when you talk about an ETF, and even if you break it down, it's invested in individual businesses, you can't touch a share. Yeah, you can go and touch, we've got JB Hi-Fi here and you understand what they do and they sell stuff and that's how they make money, but it's not as tangible in people's minds.
Yeah.
And I tend to think that coupled with the fact of what you were saying before in terms of the returns from an absolute perspective are higher, I think that's people's natural sort of lean towards property.
Which also tends to skew things slightly.
Oh yeah.
Because I mean, the amount of times and this goes back into the cost conversation that we were having previously. The reverse can also be true. So the amount of times that we've sat in front of someone and they made so much money in property. I bought this property for $600,000, it's worth $1 million. I made $400,000. And it's like, well, not really. You bought a property for $600,000. It was an investment property. You paid stamp duty to enter into it. You paid mortgage repayments over the course of the last 10 years. So there was interest that was associated with that property. You've done repairs, you've done maintenance. In addition to that, when you sold the property, you also needed to pay an agent. You needed to cover all of your sale costs. There was periods of time where it was untenanted. And then you need to pay a capital gains tax at the end of it. It's like, so you haven't really made $400,000. Really what you made was, maybe $200,000.
Yep.
And I'm just using random numbers here, but the reverse can also be true in that you have a perception of making, because you're talking about large sums of money, because you're talking about, what most people see is entry and exit costs and nothing in between. The calculation can be very different to what you expect.
Yeah, no, and easy to overlook because everybody's heard of those stories that my grandfather or my parents bought that property, back in the day, and they bought it for this and sold it for that, or it's worth this. Yeah, it's all that's associated with it. Andrew, some advantages of an ETF versus property, because we're trying to put forward a balanced view here. ETF gives you the ability to sell at any time, right? It's a lot more liquid.
Yeah.
When we talk about the next topic, it's also going to be seen as a disadvantage as well too. So that's interesting enough. The transaction costs, can't downplay that. Rebalancing, so tweaking the portfolio, making sure it's aligned to your asset allocation, that's done really, really quickly. Versus a property, you can't sell them. I mean, you can't sell it quickly, so it's not liquid. It's going to take time. You can't sell a portion of it. You may be selling in the wrong market, which is a really big consideration as well too around market timing. It's just hard up. Plus the cost associated with it to do it correctly. Chances are you're going to have to either do some repairs or maintenance or staging of the property. Plus, when you sell it, if you're going to do it properly, you're giving 1.5% to 2% for a real estate agent as well to sale costs.
Yeah, and the implications of making a mistake are huge. So when you do talk about, diversification, it's not just diversification if something happens in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Plenty of people are very intelligent, have done a lot of analysis, and make mistakes on an asset that they purchase, whether it's in property or whether it's in an ETF or shares. You make a wrong purchase in an ETF or a share, okay, you just sell and you buy another one. Like, you reposition your portfolio, provided that you've got, the wherewithal to recognize that, hey, this maybe wasn't the best asset and I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I shouldn't have invested in this, if I was small cap that invests in some niche that, someone told me was going to make a lot of money, versus someone who goes down a particular property decision and they invest in an asset that they thought they could develop, or they thought that they could do something with in order to, magnify gains and make things, really special. You make a wrong decision in a property transaction, you could potentially be dead in the water. Yeah. I mean, you consider the fact that, hey, it's a 5% deposit and I paid, $600,000 or $700,000 for this property. And in reality, it's not worth that. And it was actually worth, $550 or $600. Well, how long is it going to take in order to be able to make that money up? And that loss of time to make that money back up. I can't sell the property because I'm not going to be able to expunge the mortgage, and I'm not going to be left with a personal loan at the end of it. The impact of making one wrong decision is huge when it comes to the property, versus not quite as large if you are diversifying and if you're not putting all of your eggs in some small niche bucket when it comes to ETFs.
Yeah, and that's because the shot that you're shooting is so big in order to get into property, right? So, yeah. Andrew, an interesting take around the behavioral aspect of it, right? So often the way that I tend to view a mortgage, because of all of those reasons that we were talking about before, cost to get in and so on and so forth, plus the time frame and the difficulty that it takes in order to get out of the property, looking at this and going, okay, is a mortgage, because of the asset class and its very nature, I think people view it as a long-term investment for the majority of the time. Does a mortgage create some sort of forced savings?
Because I think that's how people view it. I think that's how people view it. I think that's what actually happens.
Well,
I think, with a controversial opinion here, but let me put it out there. I think that the narrative around, okay, I am going to not purchase property, right? I'm going to make that decision. I'm going to say purchasing an owner-occupied property is stupid. I'm going against the tide, you reckon? Here we go. Andrew Nicolaou on the record. I'm going to rent where I live. Mm-hmm. My rent is going to say be $2,500 a month, equivalent, mortgage repayment on the equivalent property would be, say, $4,500 a month. I'm going to take that $2,000 a month and I'm going to put that into investments. I'm going to rent where I live. And I'm going to compound out those scenarios over the course of the next 30 years. And as a result of it, it's going to be more beneficial to invest in an ETF because the rates are higher, blah, blah, blah. That is bullshit. I have sat in front of any number of clients. You can run through these scenarios. You can run through all of this analysis. You can say, yes, I'm going to invest the proceeds and I'm going to invest the different. It does not happen in the real world. Nobody actually does that. And nobody I've seen, and maybe there is, a monk in the Himalayan mountains that has the discipline to be able to do something like this. But I have not seen someone stick to a strategy so perfectly that these scenarios actually work out. The forced savings that's associated with buying a property and needing to make mortgage repayments and needing to stick to that over the course of a 30-year time horizon is, you cannot understate it, because in the real world, and that's where we live, and that's where we talk to clients, and that's where we see things, people do not have the discipline to say, I'm going to invest this difference for such a long period of time, and I'm going to maintain that. Because over time, the difference is larger. Because if you pay down your mortgage, or if you had expunged your mortgage, you should be investing more. And if you had repairs and maintenance that would need to go into a mortgage, or if you did renovation costs, you should be putting lump sums into. People do not have the discipline to say, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm actually going to stick to it. Yeah. So I don't think that this is a numerical conversation. And I don't think that this is a conversation around what the numbers say is the best thing to do. I think that this is a conversation around what actually happens in the real world and what people actually do. And in the real world, people, when they put money into ETFs, will pull money out because, as they can. I can't.
Yeah.
And the illiquidity of property is, provided that you do it in the right way, the benefit of investing in property.
Yeah.
And the liquidity that's associated with ETFs is the benefit, but also the detriment of ETFs. And so going back to Billy's point and going back to what people should actually do in the real world at the end of my 4-minute rant is you have to have a strategy that combines elements of both, that's tailored to your situation. I think that there are a large portion of first-time buyers that should not be getting into a property investment with a 5% deposit, having no leverage, and all of their cash flows going towards this property. They're in mortgage stress from day one. They cannot afford the repayments. They cannot afford to live and do all of the other things, and that's setting people up for failure. But I also think that there's a large portion that should be getting into a property investment because they're spending their money needlessly. And yes, they're putting some money towards ETFs and they feel like they're doing the right thing. But at the end of the day, they're overspending everywhere else and having a mortgage over their head to force repayments with forced savings. And there is a combination of people that are investing in one or the other and should be doing both. So what is right for you in your circumstances is what is right for you in your circumstances. And this isn't you can win in one but not in the other. It's how do you utilize this, or how do you get into the right asset for you at the right time?
Woo,
long rant.
Go, Andrew, take a breath. Okay, so we're coming to the conclusion. The conclusion is that the mortgage repayment is like forced savings, and that has to happen because you don't have the choice to be able to stop paying your mortgage. I mean, you do, but then you're going to suffer the consequences, right? So forced savings down that path. Whereas if you're looking at an ETF, it's not mandated. You can start and stop. You can play around with it. And the worst thing that you could possibly do is change your strategy. So completely agree. And just pivoting, I mean, that's the reason why superannuation works so well. One, it's mandated. So your employer has to put in 12%. And then two, you can't actually touch it. Yeah, you can change the investment options and stuff, but you can't go in there and say, oh, I need 50 grand because I want to, buy a new car, or I want to extend the deck, or whatever it may be. It's forced savings. So when we compare the two scenarios, I guess the gold here is when you're looking at an ETF versus a property, it's really around that behavioral piece saying, hey, if you are going to do the ETF route and or property, then the forced savings that comes with property should apply to the entire strategy right across the board. And if you're going to commit to something, you should really stick to it, because it goes back to the fundamentals of the asset classes. They behave differently. They behave differently, but if you stop contributing to them, stop, taper around with it, it has a huge impact, and you can't really do a fair comparison. And whichever way you've gone, you're not really doing yourself justice if you don't stick with it.
Yeah, 100% agree. So at the end of that rant, and off the back of all of that, I dare say that anyone who says that an ETF is the only way to go, or anyone who says that, property is the only way to go, usually is incentivized on either side to, go or to recommend someone go into a particular asset. And so I think that taking a balanced view and looking at things to realistically say, okay, it's not a matter of or, it's a matter of what is the timing and what is going to be the right thing for me at this point in time, which is versus a future point in time, is really what leads to the best outcomes.
And probably the question that says, that person, if you do go down the ETF path, can they actually stick to the investment over time?
I mean, really stick to it. Yeah.
Because it should be non-negotiable, like your mortgage repayment.
I mean, look, like I'll tell you, even from my own perspective, maybe to finish it off. If you had $1 million mortgage and if you had $1 million property and you had a mortgage of 800 grand,
mm-hmm.
and you pay that $800,000 property down to $500,000, your mortgage repayments were still the same, and you'd built $500,000 worth of equity. you'd still be making your mortgage repayments.
Yeah.
Exactly the same way. If you had started an investment with a couple of grand, made some contributions to it, and you had no mortgage, and all of a sudden you had $500,000 in an ETF, do you really have, and I don't, and I haven't seen anyone that does, but do you have the discipline to continue making the exact same contributions towards that investment and not say, I'm going on holiday, I can reduce contributions by, a little bit for 6 months. Yeah, I can get the level of discipline that's needed it's beyond monk-like, is in my opinion. So I think having a combination of both is ultimately where it ultimately lands. And if you do decide to go down one route, then be prepared that you have to have a huge amount of discipline to really stick to it.
Andrew, well said. I think that wrapped it up nicely. Thank you for today.
Thanks, Bills. Thanks for listening into my rant at the end of it, to all of that viewers now listeners, for those that made it to the end.
Normally it's me who's doing the rant, sharing the stage.
If you did get some value out of that one, please like, subscribe, share this with your friends and all the other TikTok influencers that are out there. But no, in all seriousness, we look forward to catching on the next podcast, and thanks a lot, Bills.
Thanks, Andrew. Cheers.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
The information in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into account your personal objectives, financial situation, or needs. It is not financial, legal, or tax advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should consider whether the information is appropriate to your circumstances and seek professional advice before acting on any of the information provided. Past performance is not a reliable indicator of future performance. This information is provided by Billy Amiridis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Pty Ltd, authorized representatives and credit representatives of Akumin Financial Planning Pty Ltd.